Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Marquette University Law School, the Lubar Center. I'm Mike Goucher, and this is On the Issues. Today, we're talking with Katherine Gehl and Austin Ramirez. They are the co-founders of an organization called Democracy Found. It was created back in 2018. It's pushing for changes to our election rules. They're in favor of something called Final Five voting. Some people know it as the ranked choice voting idea, and we're going to be talking more about what that might look like coming up in the next half hour or so. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about our guest. Katherine Gehl is the former CEO of Gehl Foods here in Wisconsin. But in recent years, she's turned her attention to politics and how our political system is working or not working. She is the co-author of The Politics Industry, How Political Innovation Can Break Gridlock and Save Our Democracy, a book she wrote with Harvard business professor Michael Porter. She is also the founder of the Institute for Political Innovation. Austin Ramirez is the CEO of Husco International, which is based in Waukesha. He spent a year as a White House fellow in the National Economic Council of both the Obama and Trump administration. So a fairly interesting experience. I'm sure we'll talk about that today too. But first of all, thanks to both of you for being with us today.
Thank you, Mike.
So Katherine, I think you were here 4 years ago, maybe 2017. This is right before your book, The Politics Industry, was published. I know in that time you have been pushing for changes to election rules, and we'll spend some time talking about exactly what that change would look like coming up. But I want to begin with something that I saw you say in your recent TED Talk, and I thought this was just an interesting way of describing Washington politics. And you said, and I'm quoting now, "Washington isn't broken. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's just not designed to serve us." I'd like you to go into that a bit. What do you mean by that?
Yes, this insight, which I was brought to by a good friend of mine, Congressman Mickey Edwards, about 8 years ago now, is really what launched this work. The idea is we are constantly saying Washington is broken, and yet that leads us to looking in the wrong place for the solutions, because we look at what the candidates are doing, or we look at the policies, or we look at the parties. And instead, it turns out that what really matters is the system, the rules of the game, the behaviors and activities that are rewarded and those that are not rewarded. And it turns out that what we see happening in Washington, D.C., the thing that makes 90% of the country approximately dissatisfied with Washington, D.C., is the behavior that's rewarded in our election system. So instead of focusing on the drama and the personalities, it's actually perhaps maybe slightly less interesting at first glance, but way more powerful to look at what gets people reelected, and therefore what's the most important things they're responding to. And that is where the power comes from this entire set of work. And what we find is that when people have a chance to look at it that way, it comes off as a, why didn't I ever see it that way before? Because it's obvious to almost all of us once we look at it. Well, of course, if the way to keep your job is to do those things, you're going to do those things. So our task is to make keeping the job the same as getting results for the country.
If you briefly had to describe how Washington is functioning today, what are the words you would use to do that?
I think I would repeat what you said, is that it's functioning the way it's designed to function. Okay. And what that means is that currently the system forces the sides apart, the Democrats and Republicans, that we think that the people really want to be that far apart, and that they really want to get nothing done, and they want to demonize the other side, and that they almost like doing that. But actually, behind closed doors, so many of our elected officials in Congress would say they would like to have the freedom and the incentive to work together and negotiate and find consensus. But that's not what wins party primaries. So Washington is working in the necessary way that our election system makes it work. And everybody's dissatisfied, those people doing the jobs and those of us that need the jobs done well.
Yeah, more extremism, more gridlock, things just not getting done and not being able to tackle big problems. Austin Ramirez, I have to ask you about your experience in Washington. So you go there and you work actually at a time where you're serving both when the Trump administration is in power and also when the Obama administration is in power. You're there for that really interesting time. What was your takeaway from that experience and how has it influenced your work today?
Oh, thanks, Mike. Yeah, so 4 years ago today, I was working for President Trump on his economic policy agenda. And my big takeaway from my year in DC, from a positive lens, was that here I worked for two presidents that couldn't be more different temperamentally, ideologically, in almost every way. And yet, when you looked at their economic policy teams, right, not the politicians, but the policy experts that advised the president, both presidents, while they disagreed on some things, they agreed on far more than they disagreed relative to manufacturing policy and trade policy and infrastructure investment and all the things that we care about. There was much more overlap than I expected. And I was living this experience right as Katherine was drafting her initial paper. So I was reading a draft of her paper and living this experience. And it all clicked for me that the problem isn't a policy problem. It's not that we have a lack of widely agreed upon solutions to make this country wealthier and more equal and more thriving in every way. What we have is an incentive design problem. It's just was so clear to me as a business person living in this strange political world that the politicians are behaving this way because that's the way that the election system incents them to behave. So if we want to see different behavior, we don't need different people. We need different incentive systems.
What I find interesting about both of your comments is that you're saying that a lot of politicians would like to be freed from the current system as it exists right now. Would that be correct?
Yes, that would be correct. Now, how many of them will have the freedom to say that they would like to be free? That's a different number, a smaller number.
So I have seen you, Katherine, talk about this as saying that the real problem is election rules and the way we do elections right now. And we'll talk about how we do them and what you'd like to change. But there are always people out there who will say, well, no, I don't know. Is that really the problem? Is it gerrymandering's the problem? Is it big money or dark money in politics? Is that the problem? How did you come to the conclusion that changing election rules would really be the solution to the problems we face today?
It's a super important question because so many of us are concerned, but then what should we do with our concern? And I will note there are many contributions, many contributors to the dysfunction that Austin and I have just described. The question that I posed was which of the problems that we have in our country that contribute to that would be, if we could change it, would be powerful, would likely change the outcomes that Washington, D.C. delivers, but also which are the things we actually could change. So people listening may have their biggest concern in their heart. For some people, it is gerrymandering, as you mentioned. For some people, it's campaign finance. For some people, it is that our voting system is not working how they think it should work. The thing that we have to look at is which of these things do we have power over? And it turns out that what is at the intersection, what's at the sweet spot of something that's powerful and also achievable is changing our election rules, because our Constitution gives each state the power to change those rules. So we don't have to ask Washington, D.C. to change the rules. We can take care of it ourselves in our respective states, which means that we have a lot more agency. We have a lot more to say about this dysfunction and a lot more power in changing it than most of us have known.
So, Austin, you and Katherine have created this organization, Democracy Found, to help advance and advocate for some of these changes. What is your hope? What would you like to see Democracy Found be able to accomplish in the discussion? And then we'll get right into exactly what you want to replace and what you want to replace it with. So, but let's first talk about the mission of Democracy Found.
Yeah, great. So we think of Democracy Found more as a campaign than an organization. We don't exist to kind of fulfill some high-minded principles over a long period of time. We exist to implement two very specific election reforms. That's getting rid of closed primaries and implementing a single ballot, top 5 primary, and then using ranked choice voting in the general election. So again, the whole effort is geared at trying to execute those two changes as quickly as we can.
And we'll get into this now with Katherine. So in your TED Talk, I think you referred to them as 2 bad rules in elections that you would like to change. And tell us what the 2 bad rules are, and then we'll talk about what you'd like to change that would address the problems that you feel they've caused.
Great. Bad rule number 1 is that we have party primaries. So we're all familiar with those elections, the ones that take place, in the summer before a general election, but very few of us go to party primaries. In the country, it's about 10% of people who participate in party primaries. And what happens is you go to the primary and vote in the Democrat primary or the Republican primary, and voters in party primaries tend to be more ideological than voters as a whole. And some of us are familiar with what that means, which is people say different things to get through their primary. So it pushes people further to the right and further to the left. But the real problem with the party primary is not what people have to say to get elected. It's that once they're in Washington, D.C., it is the biggest contributor to their decision-making on what they're going to get done or not, which is to say, when one of our congresspeople has an opportunity to consider how they're going to vote on a bipartisan compromise bill on one of the biggest issues, let's say infrastructure, immigration, or some of the economic policies that Austin would have dealt with at the White House, we would think that the questions they ask themselves are, is this a good idea? Is this the right policy to move the country forward? Is this what the majority of my constituents want? But it's actually none of those. The question that first comes is, will I win my next party primary if I vote yes for this bill? And if the answer to that question is no, and on the big issues, for both sides, it almost always is, then the rational incentive to get reelected dictates that that congressperson is going to vote no, which means that the 10% of voters who are in the party primaries are in charge of what's happening. It's not the general election voters. It's not the citizens as a whole. It's that narrow swath of voters. And it's great that they're engaged, but we have to concern ourselves with the fact that it pushes the sides apart and basically forbids them from working together. So that's bad rule number 1.
Bad rule number 2?
Bad rule number 2, I'll tell you what it is, but let me say the result for a moment. So in any other industry, as large as politics and as thriving as politics, which is to say there's a lot of power and money and success in the politics industry, if you had an industry like that and so many customers were dissatisfied, which is the case with politics, customers are dissatisfied. If it was my former company or Austin's former company and our customers didn't like us that much, there would be an entrepreneur who would come in and create a new competitor to give the customers what they wanted. But we can see that that never happens in politics. We have the same 2 parties no matter what, no matter how dissatisfied the customers are. And without healthy competition to sort of force the hand of those currently in the industry, we don't get the innovation, the results, and the accountability that we see when we have healthy competition. So that means, and we don't have that competition because of bad rule number 2, and that is the way we vote. In America, we use plurality voting. It means the person with the most votes wins. seems logical, but it's actually a really huge problem, because that means in any race of more than 2 candidates, someone can win with less than a majority. And that creates a spoiler effect. So essentially, you'll see 2 candidates, and then let's say that someone wants to come in as an independent. And that independent is called a spoiler, or the third party is called a spoiler. You can't vote for Jill Stein. You'll take votes away from Hillary and spoil the election for her. You can't vote for Gary Johnson, the libertarian, because you'll take votes away from Trump and spoil the election for him. We have to get rid of the spoiler problem so that more people can compete, and they'll either win or they'll put pressure on the current winners to do different things. And we do that by getting rid of plurality voting. And that's what Austin was referring to, that we'll use instant runoff voting instead.
So let's talk, and Austin, I'll have you walk us through this, and please help us understand how this would work practically speaking. So you want to get rid of these 2 bad rules, as Katherine describes them, and you want to replace them with what precisely?
Yeah, let me just, I want to emphasize something Katherine said, because I think it's so fundamental to why these reforms are important. And this was so eye-opening to me when I went to DC, which is that politicians, when they make decisions, the first screen that they go through isn't what's the right decision to make from a policy perspective, from a what's best for the country perspective. The first question they ask is, what's politically feasible for me? And then that limits what the next screen is. So what's the next best answer from everything that's ruled out that won't impact my ability to win a party primary? And that is what is so dysfunctional about the way the current election system is set up. So that's the heart of what we're trying to remove. It's not that we need different people or even different ideas. It's really allowing our politicians to execute on things that they already know they should be doing. So how do we do that, to your question? The first step is to get rid of the party primary and implement a single ballot top 5 primary. So the voter will come into the election booth on primary day. They'll have a list of everybody that has gathered enough signatures to run for that office. And we're talking about federal elections only in the state of Wisconsin. So
just Congress and Senate. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the candidates will still have a letter next to their name: Republican, Democrat, Independent, Green, whatever they want to choose. And the voter will pick their favorite, their one favorite. And then we'll tally all those votes up. The top 5 vote getters will proceed to the general election. And in the general election, the voter will come into the booth, and they will be able to, if they choose, rank those 5 candidates. So if the voter wants to, they can still just vote for their favorite, just like they do today. The voter's never worse off under these voting conditions. But if they want to, they can vote for a third party or an independent candidate, or whoever is their favorite, first, and then rank their other choices. So they can just rank a first and a second. They can rank all 5. They can, it's up to the voter to decide how deep into the ballot they want to go. And then we tally all the votes. If somebody has a majority, 50% plus 1, the election's over. If nobody has a majority, you drop the lowest vote getter and you assign those votes to their second place choice. And then you rerun the tally. Again, if somebody has 50% plus 1 vote, the election's over. If not, you drop the next lowest candidate, and so on until somebody has a majority.
And Katherine, is there, based on where this has been tried in other places, is there evidence that suggests this produces different outcomes, that it causes different behavior? Do we know that at this point in time?
We don't yet know what the combination of open top 5 primaries and instant runoff general elections delivers, because it's a new innovation. The good news is that it has been implemented in Alaska as of November of 2020. So we can begin to see indications of the freedom that it gives. Because here's what I'll underscore again, what Austin said at the beginning of his last discussion. Final 5 voting is not designed to necessarily change who wins. It's designed to change what the winners are incented to do and have the freedom to do. So when we look at Senator Lisa Murkowski in Alaska, she hasn't been elected under the new rules yet, but the calculus that she makes, the decision that she makes now, she doesn't have to ask herself, will I lose my party primary? Because she knows she'll be in the top 4. So she can always make her decisions looking at the general election voters, looking at all the voters of her state, as that is politically feasible for her now, to use Austin's words. And that gives her the ability to negotiate and reach consensus in a way that others don't have. What we need to see the outcomes from Washington, D.C. change is a critical mass of people who have that same freedom so they can use their leadership. So in my estimation, if we had only 3 states that changed these rules, you'd have 6 senators out of 100. 5 states, you have 10 senators. And I hope that's what we'll have as a minimum of 5 states after the next midterms in 2022. And then you have a core of people from both parties who aren't prisoners of their ideology, but rather they can afford and they're incented to work together. And that's when we will start to see the different outcomes from Washington, D.C.
So even the impact of just a small number of states could be enormous based on the possibility that it would cause behavioral changes by other folks. So.
Yes, it's absolutely true. Look, when we look back and say, how did X legislation come about? It's often, if it's major legislation, if it's going to be passed on a bipartisan basis, you have a nucleus of people. We hear of the Gang of 6 or the Gang of 8, that are coming together to try to figure out how to craft a complicated, consensus agreement in what are challenging issues. That's a hard thing to do. But when they work together that way, then they can bring in colleagues from both of their sides, respectively. And by having this bench of people who have that freedom, you've basically created a much stronger opportunity for those bipartisan gangs of however many to come together, because they're uniquely free to do that kind of work. And they can say in public the things that many people only feel free to say behind closed doors today. So that begins to change the dialogue as well.
So let me have you respond to some things you hear from skeptics of this or critics of this idea. They will say that this idea of ranked choice voting could be confusing to voters. And anytime you add confusion to the mix, it can result in lower turnout. Is that a concern? You were very clear in saying that people can choose to participate in the ranked vote. They don't have to rank the candidates if they don't want to. But is there the potential for any confusion, and as a result, the potential for voters to say, "Whoa, I don't know if I want to go cast my ballot today"?
Yeah, thankfully, although this package of primary and general election reforms hasn't been implemented widely in other places, ranked choice voting or instant runoff voting is used in other places. Right. So we actually have data that shows that not only does it not suppress turnout at elections, but voters prefer this ability to rank their candidates. So I think both kind of conceptually, you can just rank one if you want, or you can rank all 5. Voters never worse off, as well as the actual results from elections using instant runoff voting show that this is something that voters like, that they want.
And something else I mentioned earlier was the impact of big money in campaigns. Does this really fundamentally change that? Because won't there always be special interest groups who will want to support a particular candidate in a race? And this would not necessarily change their behavior, would it?
No, here's what we'll say. First, the reason we don't concern ourselves, and I don't recommend in the work that we concern ourselves with campaign finance or quote money in politics, is because it's outside of that connection of being powerful and being achievable. So right now, most of the desires in campaign finance world would require a constitutional amendment, which we can't get in our divided country. So we don't even need to evaluate what would be the right solution, because none of them are really achievable in that way now. What happens with money in politics as a result of our system is still a big positive, which is to say, the only way to get reelected in our system is to appeal to a majority of general election voters. Right now, when you can win by appealing to a majority of the 10% of people voting in your party primary, that is a choke point where you can put a lot of money and special interest money into that choke point and determine who wins the primary. And then the general election doesn't matter at all. Once you switch the most important election from being the primary to the general election, it's a lot harder it's more challenging to have confidence that the candidate you're putting your money on is absolutely going to win. Because one of the reasons there's so much self-interested money in politics, self-interested special interest money, is that there's a good ROI. Okay, so you invest in the person who's won this Republican primary in this Republican district, or this Democrat primary in this blue district. You know they're going to win the general, and you invest in them, and you may later have their ear. Whereas now that investment is more subject to this free and healthy competition, and you can't be guaranteed who's going to win. The general election voters now decide who's going to win.
Austin Ramirez, tell us, we've mentioned Alaska a couple of times, and how did Alaska start down this path? They seem to be leading the way in some respects, at least in terms of states. I assume this was probably related to Katherine and Michael Porter's book in some way, or the article in Forbes magazine that they found out about this and somebody said this is a good idea. How did Alaska happen?
I'm going to let Katherine answer that because she's much more familiar with the dynamics in Alaska.
Okay.
And you are right, Mike. There were some people in Alaska who were dissatisfied, like so many of us are, looking at what they could change. And the report that I published out of Harvard Business School in 2017 with Michael Porter, which was prior to the book, made its way to Alaska. And Scott Kendall read it and decided that this would be the solution that he wanted to champion. And so he wrote the ballot measure and founded the campaign and led it all the way to its completion. It's actually phenomenal because Scott Kendall now works with us at the Institute for Political Innovation as we embark on our goal of what I would call more Alaskas. So now we need more people to be like Scott Kendall in Alaska and follow along in 2022.
So let's talk about whether Wisconsin can be a future Alaska. So you have this piece of legislation that I think was formally introduced late in March, just a few weeks ago. You've got 21 co-sponsors in the state legislature, some of whom are Republicans and some of whom are Democrats, which is not always the case. What is the future? And maybe I'll begin with Austin on this one. How do you see the future of the legislation in Wisconsin? Do you see that as having a real shot at changing the way we do elections?
This is one I can tackle. And I'm going to use gerrymandering as a foil here because I think it's a really good one. I think if you ask any intellectually honest person whether the way that we draw congressional district lines in Wisconsin is a fair and appropriate way to do it, they would say no. However, redistricting in Wisconsin is a highly partisan issue. To do it differently will be to the detriment of Republicans and the benefit of Democrats. So it is a politically charged issue, regardless of the intellectual argument against redistricting. What I love about these election reforms and what makes them feasible for implementation in Wisconsin is that there is no partisan angle to these changes. Implementing these new election rules won't flip a single district from red to blue. It only makes the elections more fair and representative of the voters in the district. So unlike redistricting, where a lot of people might not like the current system, but it's not in that achievable bucket because it is so partisan and it will hurt Republicans in Wisconsin. We can implement these voting rules and not hurt either party, hurt one party more than the other. And so, it's allowed us to develop both a supporter base of citizens that range from very conservative to very liberal, but and don't agree on any policy agenda items, but agree on having a functional democracy. So we've got a very politically diverse group of supporters, and also when it comes to legislators that actually have to pass these changes, we've been able to recruit a bipartisan group that look at what's happening in DC and can say, "Gosh, this is broken. We clearly have an incentive problem to fix. And here's a solution that allows us to do that without immediately falling into partisan warfare because it's going to help one party and hurt the other." So long answer to a short question of, do I think it's feasible? Absolutely, I think it's feasible. I think if we've got a challenge in Wisconsin, It's that only a really small portion of the population understands these voting changes that we are proponents of. And it may take some time. It may take a couple of years for us to really socialize these ideas and get people comfortable with these new voting processes. But the good news is that once people hear it, they like it. It's a pretty intuitive change. And we've seen that both with state legislators as well as different citizens of Wisconsin as we've talked about these changes across the state.
Talk a little bit more about building the support for this in a moment, but Austin, just want to follow up on that. So have you talked with Republican leadership? Because I could imagine a world in which the Republican leadership in Madison might say, you know what, we're kind of happy with the way the system is working. We control the Senate, we control the Assembly, we're in strong positions in both of those places. Why would we want to do something where we don't know what that future might look like? What do you say to that?
Well, that's one of the reasons we started with federal elections only. So we're asking the Wisconsin legislature and governor to change the rules for how we send our Wisconsin representatives to Washington, D.C. And if there's one thing that we all agree on, it's that Washington isn't working the way we want it to work. So I think it's a lot easier argument to ask them to implement these election changes for federal elections as opposed to state elections. Mm-hmm. That said, we're not shy about saying that we think this is a better way to run elections. So we hope that once we implement this for federal elections, we implement it statewide, because this is a better, more representative way to choose our political leaders. And once citizens get a shot at voting under these new rules, under these new processes, they're going to like them and they're going to want them everywhere.
Are you optimistic, Catherine, about the chances of this moving through the legislature, getting support so that you could change the way we vote in congressional and Senate races?
Oh, yes, I share Austin's optimism. And I'll note also that Mike Gallagher, who is our Republican congressman who has come on board as a big champion of Final Five voting, talks about this as not only being the right thing for the voters and the citizens and the right thing so we could get stuff done once again in Washington, D.C., but talks about it as being good for his and others' job satisfaction in Congress and the Senate. Because again, now they could actually go there and have a chance of accomplishing the things that they care about in a sustainable way where we're not going to careen back and forth between administrations. And I think that combination of it being the right thing to do when we think about the values of democracy, which is make the general election the election that matters, not the primary, but also the right thing to do to get outcomes, to incent and encourage people to work together, and finally be something that makes the jobs actually have more agency and satisfaction. That's a great trifecta that will get us the support that we need. And I would agree with Austin, though, that the biggest challenge we have right now is getting the message out that it doesn't have to be this way. And that those rules that we have that we're so used to, party primaries and plurality voting, they're not in the Constitution. In fact, the Constitution specifically says that each state needs to make these rules. So the founders gave us not just the opportunity to make those rules the way we need to, but also the responsibility. And that's one of the things I like about one of our original co-authors and lead sponsor, Gehl Foods, a state senator from the Brookfield area, is that he talks about it that way, that he says we have the responsibility in Madison to do our job to affect Washington, D.C. We can't just say it's their problem because we're in charge of the rules that make it so problematic.
So perhaps each of you can give me an idea of how you do build public support for this. You said that's really the next step in this. It may take a couple of years to get the word out, to help people understand precisely what it is you're proposing. How do you do that? What's key to that? And Catherine, I'll begin with you and then we'll go to Austin.
In our early stages, we really relied on almost one-to-one discussion because this was so new. So Austin and I had a lot of, meetings with a couple of people at a time. And now we're reaching a phase where we're reaching just much more broadly to bring the ideas to a much larger group of people. I'm actually really excited because yesterday, like fewer than 24 hours ago, I have a 17-minute TED Talk that explains the two bad rules, and you've referred to it, the two bad rules, and then the solution of final five voting. And it's been viewed in less than 24 hours by about 350,000 people. Now, I hope those are all in Wisconsin, because that would really, really, really help us. And I want action more than I want views. So, but it's that kind of clear message now that will make the difference. And you'll see in our campaign, as we described Democracy Found, our organization led by a phenomenal executive director, Sarah Eskridge, that she will be overseeing an implementation of strategies to get that message out, so that people have heard of final five voting, so they know what it means, and so they see why it would be good for them, and also why it's not a Trojan horse for either party, why it is totally bipartisan. And then we grow our support from there. So it's an information and education campaign right now, almost like a public interest campaign.
Mm-hmm. Austin, any thoughts on that? How do you see building the sort of grassroots support you need to enact this kind of change?
You know, it sure helps when you have a robust intellectual underpinning for the ideas that you're proposing, right? So the book that Katherine and Michael wrote, which I think is the best political book I've ever read, but certainly in the last year, provides a context and a foundation for making the argument. And the other thing I'll say is, Mike, people are so hungry for this. I mean, who do you talk to that isn't frustrated with the way things are working in DC? And people are just desperate for a solution that is rational and nonpartisan, and no single set of reforms is going to fix everything. And let's be clear about this: implementing these voting changes in Wisconsin, or even in 5 states, I think it will have a huge positive impact on our political system, but we're still going to have lots of problems. And part of our role as citizens of the United States is to continually push to make our democracy better and better over time. So it's not a silver bullet, but it's rational. It appeals to this instinct that it's not driven by DC, it's driven by the states, right? We get to do this on a local level and put the rules in place for how we vote here in Wisconsin. And I'd say it's like, I don't know, 1 out of 20 conversations that I have where people kind of have real problems with these ideas, and 19 out of 20, and maybe even higher than that, people really grasp onto this pretty quickly and support it pretty enthusiastically.
Another way to change political systems is to run for office. And I asked Katherine about this back in 2017 because her name was being mentioned. But it actually goes to both of you. I mean, did you think about trying to change this in a different way by saying, if I ran for office, or if I got behind other individuals who represented sort of this different thinking, that we could change things that way? Did you give that thought? Was there any consideration? Austin, I'll begin with you.
Yeah, I am utterly convinced that the impact that I can have by promoting these changes to our political system is far greater than I would ever have as a political leader. So, as somebody that cares a lot about our state and about our democracy, if I thought by running for office I could make the sort of change that is going to make this country, a significantly better place, more so than I do in my day job or by doing the other things I do, it's something I'd think about. But I'm convinced that promoting these systematic changes to how we elect our leaders is far more impactful than any single politician could ever be.
Catherine, I'll ask you basically the same question.
And I'm going to give you the exact same answer as Austin in response to that question. And I now do work full time because I sold my company in 2015 in part to do this political work. And I'm full time at the Institute of Political Innovation now and bringing these ideas across the country. So what we do, just a brief note about what we do nationally, and I mentioned a little before, we want more Alaskas. So Austin and I co-founded Democracy Found, which is working in Wisconsin. But then I also work with my team at the Institute to found and support and incubate campaigns for Final Five voting in other states in the country. And I believe that we will watch for the vote totals in November of 2022 for multiple referendums on Final Five voting in states around the country. And that will be, an exciting time. And that is my absolute best use. Now, I do say, though, we do need amazing people running for office who take the courageous steps that Danny Remer and Dale Kuinga have taken to sponsor this legislation, to champion it, and then a governor who's going to sign it. So my hope, I'm sure Austin shares it, is that this idea could be the one, or maybe there's more, but at least one issue on which all of the gubernatorial candidates agree in our upcoming cycle. And that's the question I would end up having for them is, will you sign this legislation if it's delivered to you by the legislature? And I hope we'll get everybody to say yes to that.
Also, I just got to go back to something that we talked about earlier. And, and you made the point, obviously, this is about Congress. This is about the Senate. It's not about the state assembly or the Senate. But I think what I was trying to get at there is that are there going to be people who say, boy, if we open this door for these types of elections, are we opening the door for this for legislative elections, which could affect who controls power in Madison? Are you concerned that some people will see this strictly as a political calculus? That boy, if we go forward with something that's kind of big and bold and people like it, how do we stop it in the future? Is that a concern?
Absolutely. I mean, in fact, most legislators will look at this through the political calculus of how could it change the power dynamics in the state over time. And that's where resistance is going to come from. The status quo has huge momentum on anything, especially in our political system where things, move slowly and are so, instantly tribalized on almost every issue. So there is for sure going to be institutional resistance to this. I take a lot of heart from two things. One is, this bill has just been introduced and we've got, 19 co-sponsors, I think is the number.
It's 22.
22 co-sponsors. And I mean, and on a bipartisan basis, I don't know of anything else going on in Wisconsin that has that much bipartisan support. So I take a lot of encouragement from that. And I think ultimately, if we want to implement these things, our job is to convince the voters that this is how they want to cast their vote. This is how they want to elect their leaders. If we do that, regardless of the status quo, regardless of the institutional momentum, we can get these changes made.
Final question, Katherine. Would it be easier if we had ballot initiatives here in Wisconsin? I mean, you can do that in Alaska, but you can't do it here.
That's an interesting question. Half the states can take it to the voters like Alaska did, and half the states need to do it the way we are doing it in Wisconsin through the legislature. In fact, ballot initiatives are super expensive, unbelievably expensive, and you have a date at which you win or lose, and then when you've lost, you've really lost. In the case of legislatures, they actually could work faster, which is to say, it's fine with us if they pass it next week and sign it next week. They can do it the moment there's the political will to do it, if they're in session. So as soon as we, the voters, the citizens, the business leaders, come to them with our shared concern about Washington, D.C., they can make their move. And as far as whether it would be better with a ballot initiative, we don't have that option and we're not going to have it. So I never spend my time sort of trading off those things. We just go down the path which we have to travel, which is this legislative path. And I think what's really interesting is Wisconsin was a leader 100 years ago when we had a corrupt political system. And Wisconsin was, under Fighting Bob LaFollette, one of the leaders in changing the rules of the game that made the system corrupt then. And we can once again be one of the leaders in the country changing the rules of the game now, because across this country, people are looking for something that's going to make a difference and for something that isn't just another promise from one side or the other, that this hero will fix it, but something they can believe in. And Final Five voting, when we get it in front of people, does have that effect. So I think it's a huge opportunity for this governor, for our next governor, and a huge opportunity for the legislature to get that bill to their desk.
Katherine Gehl and Austin Ramirez are the co-founders of Democracy Found. They are pushing for Final Five voting here in the state of Wisconsin. It's great to see both of you again. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
And thank you to all of you watching today. We'll see you next time here on The Issues. I'm Mike Goucher. Have a great day.